Of rapper Julio Foolio, the judge who oversaw the trial of Alicia Andrews, the woman convicted in his death, has been removed from the case.
Yeah, the state Supreme Court stepped in after concerns were raised about the judge's conduct during and after that trial.
Julio's female killer has now won her appeal and walked away from the Julio murder case, an outcome that very few people believed was even possible. For most observers, this was not just unexpected, it felt unreal. The reaction from Bro Julio's mother said everything without a single word being spoken. What came through was shock layered on top of grief, anger tangled with disbelief. It's a kind of response that only surfaces when a family feels the system has failed them not once, but twice. Before her response can even be understood, it matters to step back and examine how this result was allowed to happen, because the legal road that led here represents one of the most surprising and unsettling turns this case has taken. What unfolded next was not the result of a minor technicality or a harmless procedural slip. It was a deliberate and strategic legal maneuver that completely overturned what prosecutors believed was a locked-in conviction. The unraveling of this case exposed weaknesses that had been present from the very beginning but were ignored because confidence was high. Once those cracks were finally examined under pressure, the entire structure began to collapse in ways that no one inside the courtroom appeared prepared for. Alicia Andrews was the first of the 5 suspects connected to the Julio murder to actually face a jury. Prosecutors entered her trial with visible confidence. In their view, this was the strongest case tied to the incident, the one designed to establish momentum and set the tone for every defendant who would follow. They presented phone records showing movement, travel from Jacksonville to Tampa, and cell phone pings connecting 2 towers along that route. Surveillance footage was introduced that they believed placed her where they needed her to be at critical moments. From the outside, the case appeared airtight.
But her sentence has been put on hold, and it has to do with her attorneys trying to get the judge disqualified.
The question was never whether a conviction would happen, but how heavy the sentence would ultimately be. That certainty is what made what came next so destabilizing. After Alicia Andrews was convicted of manslaughter, her legal team did not move quietly toward sentencing. Instead, they took an aggressive and highly unusual turn. Rather than preparing mitigation arguments, they filed an appeal that immediately froze the case in place. Sentencing stopped. Momentum disappeared. The focus shifted away from punishment and onto something far more dangerous for the prosecution, whether the trial itself had been fair from the start. The appellate court then made a decision that is rarely seen. It granted the petition and removed the presiding judge from the case entirely. The ruling was based on judicial bias, a finding that carries enormous weight in the legal system. Judges are granted wide authority and discretion, but once bias is established, the legitimacy of every ruling, every instruction, and every decision made during trial comes into question. That single ruling did not just weaken the case, it altered the entire trajectory. Inside the courtroom, the issues had been accumulating long before the verdict was ever read. Alicia Andrews' legal team, led by Jeremy McLeon, documented each moment carefully and deliberately. They did not rely on vague impressions or emotional objections raised after the fact. They relied on transcripts, audio recordings, and written rulings that collectively painted a consistent picture of imbalance unfolding in real time. The earliest warning signs appeared during jury selection. The defense attempted to strike potential jurors who openly stated they did not understand rap music, rap lyrics, or the cultural environment tied to them. This case leaned heavily on rap-related disputes, street dynamics, and alleged conflicts rooted in that culture. The defense argued that jurors who admitted confusion or unfamiliarity could not fairly assess the evidence or understand the context being presented. The judge rejected that argument and required those jurors to remain seated. That decision quietly set the tone for everything that followed. The trial moved forward with a jury the defense believed was fundamentally unprepared to grasp the environment and dynamics. They were being asked to judge a flaw that would later become impossible to ignore once the case reached higher scrutiny. The imbalance became impossible to ignore once opening statements began. The judge informed both sides, clearly and on the record, that each would be given 1 hour to present their opening arguments. That instruction appeared straightforward and final. Yet when the prosecution took the floor, that limit quietly disappeared. Their opening stretched on for nearly 2 full hours, far beyond what had been stated. When the defense raised the issue during a sidebar, expecting the court to enforce its own instruction, the response was startling. The judge denied that any time limit had ever been imposed. In most courtrooms, that denial would have closed the issue immediately, except this time, it didn't. The courtroom recording told a different story. The audio and video clearly captured the judge stating that each side had 1 hour. The contradiction was preserved on the record. The judge had directly contradicted herself, not in interpretation but in plain fact. Despite that, the trial moved forward as if the discrepancy never existed, setting a precedent that rules could be stated, ignored, and then denied without consequence. As the proceedings continued, the same pattern kept resurfacing. Defense objections were routinely interrupted before counsel could fully explain their legal basis. Requests for sidebar discussions, standard and necessary practice when legal issues must be addressed outside the jury's presence, were repeatedly denied. Each of these moments, viewed in isolation, might have been dismissed as firm courtroom management. But taken together, they formed a consistent pattern of restriction placed almost exclusively on the defense. By the time the case reached the appellate court, the focus had shifted. It was no longer simply about Alicia Andrews or the outcome of her trial. The larger issue was whether the courtroom itself had functioned on equal footing, whether both sides had truly been given the same opportunity to present their case. That question is what ultimately unraveled everything and led to a result that now forces Julio's family to confront a reality they never believed was possible. This is where the situation moves from questionable into deeply troubling. When defense attorneys are prevented from fully preserving objections on the record, they lose one of the most fundamental safeguards in the justice system. Appeals are built on records. Without a clear record, higher courts have nothing to examine, nothing to correct. What happened here was not simply strict control of proceedings. It effectively blocked the defense from laying the groundwork for any future appeal, and that distinction carries enormous weight. Inside the courtroom, the imbalance continued to grow more visible. When the defense attempted to cross-examine witnesses, the judge repeatedly rushed them. They were instructed to speed up, to shorten lines of questioning, and at times to move past video evidence they believed was critical for the jury to see in full. According to the defense, that footage went directly to intent, timing, and context. Yet they were told there was no time to explore it properly. At the same time, the prosecution was granted 6 full days to present its case. 6 uninterrupted days to guide the jury through their narrative at their own pace. The defense, by contrast, was pushed to compress its entire presentation. That disparity alone raised serious concerns, because trials are not meant to be decided by efficiency. They are meant to be decided by fairness. What carried the most weight on appeal was how time expectations were communicated directly to the jury. On multiple occasions, the judge told jurors they would have the case by the end of the week. She assured them deliberations would begin by Friday. Those statements were made before the defense had finished calling its witnesses. The message was unmistakable. It was a deadline, and the defense was expected to fit within it. That kind of pressure alters the entire dynamic of a trial. When jurors are repeatedly told deliberations are imminent, urgency replaces patience. For the defense, it forced strategic decisions under artificial constraints. Alicia Andrews was facing up to 15 years in prison, yet the court appeared more focused on clearing the jury's calendar than on allowing a full and complete presentation of the defense. Her attorneys ultimately documented at least 14 separate instances of what they argued amounted to judicial bias. In their appellate filings, they pointed to a recurring pattern that appeared again and again throughout the trial. The prosecution was repeatedly allowed to frame, reframe, and at times mischaracterized the defense's arguments without meaningful correction from the bench. This tactic, commonly described as a straw man approach, involves distorting the opposing position so it can be more easily attacked. According to the defense, this was not an occasional lapse. It became routine. Each time it happened, the prosecution's narrative was reinforced, while the defense's ability to clarify or respond was narrowed. To understand why these procedural failures mattered as much as they did, it is necessary to look closely at how prosecutors described Alicia Andrews' alleged role in the killing. They did not portray her as the shooter. Instead, they framed her as the facilitator, the organizer operating behind the scenes. Prosecutors argued that she acted as a lookout and coordinator, someone responsible for tracking Julio's movements and relaying that information in real time. On the night Julio was killed in Tampa, they maintained that the digital trail left behind told a clear and deliberate story. It was Julio's birthday. He was in Tampa, attending events, making appearances, and moving between locations throughout the night. Alicia Andrews and her boyfriend, Isaiah Chance, also known as Gutter Z, traveled from Jacksonville to Tampa during that same window. Prosecutors argued this timing was not random. Phone records showed Alicia's device moving through Tampa in patterns that appeared to mirror Julio's locations. Surveillance footage placed Alicia and Chance sitting in a parking lot outside a club where Julio was scheduled to appear. They did not enter the venue. They stayed outside. They waited. During that period, prosecutors claimed Alicia was actively communicating with the shooters. According to investigators, messages sent from her phone provided updates on Julio's movements and his location. The communications were described as real-time coordination, not passive observation. Later that night, around 4:30 in the morning, Julio left his final appearance and traveled to a hotel near the University of South Florida to rest. Shortly after Julio arrived, Alicia Andrews and Isaiah Chance showed up at the same hotel. Phone records again showed messages being sent, this time alerting the shooters that Julio was now there. Surveillance footage captured Alicia and Chance leaving the area soon afterward. Not long after their departure, the shooters arrived. Moments later, Julio was shot while sitting inside his car. This sequence formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. It was structured, data-driven, and compelling on the surface. Timelines aligned. Phone records appeared to support movement. Surveillance footage provided visual confirmation. But the appeal was never centered on whether this evidence existed. The question was whether the defense was given a fair and equal opportunity to challenge how that evidence was framed, interpreted, and ultimately understood by the jury. The shooting itself left little ambiguity about intent. Julio's vehicle was struck repeatedly, round after round, tearing through the car with overwhelming force. Investigators later described the damage as extensive, the kind of attack designed to end a life within seconds. The brutality of the scene added gravity to everything that followed. After the killing, Alicia Andrews had rented an Airbnb for the trip. According to prosecutors, the three shooters went to that Airbnb with their firearms, and Alicia was inside the residence with them. There was no immediate effort, they argued, to distance herself from what had just taken place. The following day, all of them traveled back to Jacksonville together, moving as a group. To the prosecution, this behavior was central to their theory. It supported their claim that Alicia was not an unaware bystander, but someone who remained aligned with the group even after Julio was dead. Alicia's defense was built around a narrative that sharply diverged from what prosecutors presented. She maintained that she did not know a murder was going to take place. According to her account, the trip to Tampa was framed as a vacation with her boyfriend, Isaiah Chance. She argued that she became entangled in events she did not fully understand as they unfolded. Her attorneys attempted to introduce evidence suggesting that Chance was abusive, that he exerted control over her movements, and that he would at times force her to hand over her phone. The defense's goal was not to excuse what happened, but to establish fear, pressure, and coercion, rather than intent. The judge rejected that approach. She ruled that allegations of domestic abuse could not serve as a legal defense for participation in a homicide. On its face, that ruling was not unusual. Fear, manipulation, or an unhealthy relationship does not legally excuse assisting in the planning or execution of a killing. The law draws a firm boundary there, and courts have consistently upheld it. In that sense, the decision itself was not the issue. Where the case became far more complex was in determining what Alicia Andrews actually believed was going to happen that night. There is a critical legal distinction between knowingly assisting in a planned assisting in a confrontation would occur, but stop short of lethal violence. That distinction is not abstract, it is the line that separates first-degree murder from manslaughter. When the jury returned its verdict, they convicted Alicia of manslaughter, not first-degree murder. That outcome signaled something important. It suggested they believed she played a role, but may not have fully understood that the end result would be someone's death. That verdict reflected uncertainty rather than exoneration. It acknowledged involvement without concluding full intent, participation without absolute clarity. It is a narrow and uncomfortable space in the law, but one that carries enormous consequences, not just in sentencing but in how responsibility is defined and remembered. The emotional center of this case, however, has always been Julio's mother. After the appellate court removed the judge and granted Alicia Andrews relief, her reaction was immediate and unfiltered. She has spent years pushing for justice, sitting through hearings, speaking publicly, and demanding maximum accountability for everyone connected to her son's death. From her perspective, the appeal outcome felt like the system reopening a wound that never closed. Her grief is not difficult to understand. She lost her son in a violent and public killing. No parent expects to outlive their child, and even fewer are prepared for a legal process that moves slowly, shifts direction, and produces outcomes that feel disconnected from loss. Her anger and devastation are rooted in that reality. At the same time, the public narrative surrounding Julio has always been complicated. His mother has consistently described him as innocent, as someone who did not deserve what happened. That perspective reflects a parent's love and pain, but it does not fully align with the life Julio was living at the time. He was deeply embedded in an ongoing street conflict. His music openly referenced violence, rivalries, and the deaths of others connected to that feud. This was not an encounter or random crossfire. It was part of a long-running and highly visible war. Acknowledging that reality does not mean justifying his death. No one is arguing that Julio deserved to be killed. It means recognizing that the environment he operated in was already saturated with retaliation and escalation. The violence did not emerge out of nowhere. It followed patterns that had been building for years, reinforced by public statements, music, and real-world actions tied directly to the conflict. This tension between personal loss and public reality sits at the very center of the case. Julio's mother is fighting for justice as she understands it. It's driven by grief, anger, and the irreversible absence of her son. At the same time, the legal system is required to do something far less emotional and far more uncomfortable. It must separate intent from outcome, procedure from punishment, and fairness from public demand. Alicia Andrews' appeal did not declare her innocent. It did not erase what happened to Julio. It declared that the trial itself was flawed. That distinction is devastating for victims' families, but it is fundamental to how the justice system is designed to function. From the outside, the intensity of Julio's mother's pursuit of justice has raised difficult and often unspoken questions. Her pain is undeniable. No one disputes that. But the contrast surrounding this case is impossible to ignore. She is demanding accountability now, after her own loss. While her son was actively involved in a cycle of violence that caused devastation for other families long before this case ever entered a courtroom, the same type of violence she now condemns was being normalized, celebrated, and amplified through music and public behavior while it was happening to others. That contradiction is uncomfortable, but it exists whether anyone wants to acknowledge it or not. Justice cannot operate selectively. It cannot become urgent only when harm reaches your own family. Either the violence is wrong in every direction, or the standard becomes something that shifts based on loyalty, proximity, and grief. That underlying tension runs beneath every public statement connected to this case, even when it is left unsaid. It is the quiet conflict that shapes how different sides interpret the same outcome in completely opposite ways. When news broke that Alicia Andrews had won her appeal and that the judge had been removed from the case, Julio's mother responded immediately. She went to social media, expressing anger and disbelief, framing the decision as proof that the system itself is broken. From her perspective, the court had finally delivered what felt like accountability, only to take it away through what she viewed as technical maneuvering. It felt like erased progress, like an insult layered on top of loss, and a direct blow to her son's memory. That reaction is understandable from a parent who has been waiting for closure for years. The appeal decision does mean delay. The case will not move forward quickly. A new judge must be assigned. Motions will be refiled. Alicia's legal team is expected to push aggressively, potentially for a full retrial. What once appeared settled is now suspended in uncertainty, and that uncertainty extends the pain for everyone involved, especially the family who has already waited too long. At the same time, the legal system does not exist to provide emotional resolution. It exists to operate correctly. If a trial judge demonstrated bias, restricted the defense, or compromised the fairness of the process, then the appeal had to be granted. That principle does not bend based on the severity of the crime. the public's anger, or the sympathy a victim understandably receives. Allowing flawed proceedings to stand simply because the defendant is unpopular undermines the system at its foundation. The consequences of ignoring judicial misconduct stretch far beyond this single case. If bias is tolerated here, it becomes acceptable elsewhere. Today, it impacts Alicia Andrews. Tomorrow, it could affect someone with no connection to street conflicts, someone without media attention, someone without the resources to fight back. The standard must remain consistent, or it loses all meaning. That is the uncomfortable truth at the core of this case, and it is the reason this outcome, as painful as it is, could not be ignored. This situation also exposes just how fragile large street-related prosecutions can be, even when they appear overwhelming on the surface. 5 individuals were charged with first-degree murder. Each of them faces either life imprisonment or the death penalty. The evidence package includes phone records mapping, movement, surveillance footage placing people at key locations, and witness statements intended to tie the entire sequence together. On paper, it looks formidable. It looks like the kind of case prosecutors expect to withstand pressure. Yet, despite all of that, the entire prosecution has been destabilized. Not by missing evidence, but by how the courtroom itself was managed. The remaining defendants, Rashad Murphy, Isaiah Chance, and Sean Gathright, have not yet gone to trial. Their legal teams are paying close attention. Every ruling, every restriction, every moment documented in Alicia Andrews' case now serves as a reference point. The same judge, the same courtroom environment, and the same procedural patterns are being scrutinized in detail. Any indication that those issues repeat could be used to challenge the integrity of their future trials before they even begin. This is how cases begin to unravel. Not because the facts vanish, but because the process becomes impossible to defend. A courtroom that appears rushed, uneven, or driven toward a predetermined outcome creates vulnerabilities that defense attorneys are trained to identify and exploit. When the priority shifts toward securing convictions at all costs, it often produces the opposite result. The more pressure applied, the more cracks appear. Now, the path forward is uncertain. A new judge will be assigned to Alicia Andrews' case. Her legal team is pushing for a full retrial, and there is a strong possibility that request will be granted. If that happens, prosecutors will be forced to start again. The same evidence will have to be reintroduced. Same witnesses will be recalled. The entire narrative will need to be rebuilt from the ground up, this time under a different set of judicial eyes and a heightened level of scrutiny. Whether the outcome changes remains unknown. What is clear is that the chance for finality has been lost. Not because the evidence was weak, but because the foundation of the original trial could not withstand review. Once that foundation collapses, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. What makes this situation even harder to process is the timeline. Alicia Andrews has already spent more than a year and a half in custody. She was arrested in July of 2024, and it is now 2026. That time carries legal weight. If a new trial is granted and she is acquitted, or if prosecutors decide to resolve the case through a plea agreement that accounts for time already served, she could realistically walk free. That outcome would place her back in the community, despite her alleged involvement in one of the most high-profile murders in Jacksonville's recent history. That possibility alone has intensified public reaction. Some legal observers believe prosecutors may pursue a reduced plea, potentially in the range of several years, recognizing that time served and standard credits could significantly reduce what remains. Under that scenario, her release could come sooner than many expect. Others believe the state will take the opposite approach, doubling down and attempting to pursue a first-degree murder conviction. In a new trial determined to correct what they see as a procedural failure rather than a flaw in the case itself. At this stage, nothing is settled. The case exists in a legal gray area where outcomes range from immediate release to a full retrial, carrying even higher stakes. That uncertainty is what makes this moment so volatile. Every possible path forward carries consequences, not only for Alicia Andrews, but for the remaining defendants, the prosecution, and the family still waiting for answers in the wake of Julio's death. Stepping back, this case illustrates just how complex these situations become when violence, public perception, and courtroom procedure collide. a man was killed in a brutal, targeted attack. A mother lost her son and has spent years demanding accountability. Multiple defendants are now staring at the possibility of life sentences or even the death penalty. At the same time, the legal system is being forced to confront a separate but equally serious question: whether it upheld its own standards while pursuing justice in a case under intense public pressure. Julio's mother's pain is undeniable. Losing a child under these circumstances leaves wounds that do not close with time. Her fight has been relentless because, from her perspective, accountability is the only thing that gives meaning to the loss. At the same time, this case cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the reality of the environment that surrounded it. Julio was deeply embedded in a cycle of retaliation, public provocation, and ongoing conflict. That context does not excuse his death in any way, but it does explain why the violence reached him with such inevitability. The justice system exists precisely to rise above that environment. It is meant to replace street logic with process, evidence, and restraint. That balance only holds if every defendant, regardless of how serious or disturbing the accusations may be, is given a fair and impartial trial. When that standard is compromised, convictions become fragile. Even cases built on extensive evidence begin to collapse under scrutiny if the process itself cannot be defended. The evidence against Alicia Andrews suggests involvement, suggests coordination, proximity, and connection to the events that led to Julio's death. That has never been the central dispute. The issue is whether the courtroom remained neutral, whether the defense was allowed to fully test the prosecution's narrative, and whether the jury was permitted to hear and evaluate the case without pressure or imbalance. If those conditions were not met, then the conviction cannot stand. That principle is deeply uncomfortable, especially for victims' families, but it is foundational to the system. Now the case moves forward under a cloud of uncertainty. New judge will take control. Decisions will be made about whether a full retrial is required or whether a negotiated resolution becomes the preferred path. Prosecutors must decide how much risk they are willing to take, knowing that another flawed trial could cause even greater damage. Julio's family is left waiting yet again, aware that closure may still be far away and that the outcome may not resemble what they once believed was guaranteed. This case is not over. It has simply entered another phase, one defined less by evidence and more by process. How it ultimately ends will depend not only on what happened that night in Tampa, but on whether the system can correct its own failures without creating new ones in the process. For those who continue to follow cases like this, Street WRS remains focused on examining what is often overlooked, the space where procedure and outcome collide, and where lives are shaped long after the headlines disappear.